Hello. Hey, there we go. All right. Guess I'll just hold this. Okay. Hi. I guess I will start. Before I start talking about Rubygems, my name is André Arko. I am indirect on all of the internet things. I work on a project that you have probably heard of called Bundler. I've been working on Bundler for like 2 or 3 years now. I've been working on it since before 1.0 came out, and this talk is kind of about what's been happening with Bundler and Rubygems and kind of like Ruby and installing gems in general over like the last year and a half. So let's start with what happened to Rubygems in the last year. Well, I guess calling it a year is a little bit strict. This is starting in October of 2012, so that's like a year and a half ago. About a year and a half ago, Rubygems.org went down and no one could install gems for a few days. Unfortunately, that was totally my fault, and it was because the new version of Bundler at the time put a higher load on the Rubygems servers, and they couldn't handle it. So many people had installed the new version of Bundler. It slowly increased the load on the Rubygems servers. Eventually, the Rubygems servers couldn't take it, and they just went down completely. They managed to get the servers back up, and the problem is there were so many people who were now all frustrated, sitting around saying, "Why won't my gems install? Bundle install, come on!" That it just took the servers right back down again instantly. So they wound up having to turn off. We eventually figured out that the reason that the Rubygems servers were going down was completely because of Bundler. We had built a special service to try and make bundle install faster, but it turned out that that service added CPU load to Rubygems.org for every single person who ran bundle install, and there was only one server running Rubygems.org at the time, so that didn't scale very well. By the time there were about 10,000 people using the new version of Bundler, the one server just couldn't cut it anymore. So to get the server back up, we wound up turning the faster installs API completely off. And then eventually we rebuilt the API as a completely separate Sinatra app, and now it runs on Heroku, which is pretty cool. Like Heroku donates the hosting for that. And we have lots and lots of servers if we need them. And we need them most of the time. I actually gave an entirely separate talk just about that and how we built the new Sinatra app that runs on Heroku and like all of the things that we learned about concurrency and metrics and scaling. I gave that talk at last year at Scottish Ruby and various other conferences. There's totally a video online if you look it up. It's called Deathmatch Bundler versus Rubygems. So that was like October. We had barely gotten the new API up and running again when Rubygems.org went down for like a week again, and it was because there was a security breach. I don't know how many of you guys were paying attention to this, but there was a big security vulnerability in Ruby and specifically in Rails where if Rails was loaded, you could send maliciously crafted YAML documents, and just loading the YAML would create a Ruby object that executed whatever code you wanted. So this was a vulnerability in Rails that was a really big deal because every single Rails app could run any code that you wanted it to run just by making a request to it. So that got patched. The problem is Rubygems.org loads YAML files every time you upload a gem because gems have gem specs. And once you like run, so gem specs, you write Ruby code, and when you run the gem spec Ruby code, it creates a gem specification object. And so the way that gems work internally is they store a YAML version of that gem specification object, and someone figured out that they could use the same trick that had been the Rails bug to create a Ruby gem that would let them run any code that they wanted to on Rubygems.org by uploading that YAML file in a gem. So after that person had posted all of the passwords files from Rubygems.org, which was a little bit worrying, we wound up having to take down the server because we didn't know if they'd also changed some of the gems to maybe perhaps have Trojan horses in them or other equally horrifying things. So we rebuilt rubygems.org completely from scratch. It had just been on one box before. Now it's hosted on EC2. There are chef scripts to set it up automatically. Everything is way, way, way better. Ultimately, that turned out really good. And actually, all of the scripts that build rubygems.org servers are now open source. And there's a repo called, I think, Rubygems AWS that has all of the scripts in it so that it's open source and people can contribute, which is pretty great. The next thing that happened after that is that Rubygems went down again, or only went down if you were on Travis, and only went down some of the time. So Travis, as you possibly know already, is a continuous integration service where if you have an open source project, Travis will run your tests for you automatically every time you write new code. This is really super cool. Bundler uses Travis a lot. We have tons and tons of tests, and we run those tests against every version of Ruby from 1.8.7 all the way up to 2.1.1, and we run those tests not just against every version of Ruby, but also against every version of Rubygems that will run on that version of Ruby, going all the way back to Rubygems 1.3.6, and going all the way up to Rubygems 2.2. I don't remember what the newest one is, 2.2.3 maybe. So that's a lot of tests. Travis runs them all automatically, and it is probably the only reason that we have not released Bundler that does not work on one particular Ruby or one particular Rubygems. So anyway, the Bundler tests and almost every Ruby test on Travis actually started failing all the time because network requests to Travis just didn't work. And no one was really sure why they didn't work. It was just kind of like, well, if you try enough times, it works eventually, so you should just try a lot of times. Change your Travis scripts to try a lot of times, and then it'll work, it's fine, right? After a few months of that, I kind of accidentally discovered from someone else who was using the same hosting provider as Travis that it was a DNS issue. It turns out that Blue Box, the provider that was providing hosting for all of the Travis virtual machines, ran all of the virtual machines in a data center on the west coast of the United States, but they built all of the images that they used for those virtual machines in a data center on the east coast of the United States. So it turned out that they were hard coding the DNS servers to be DNS servers on the east coast, and then booting those VMs on the west coast. And that's like several thousand miles. It's a pretty long distance. And so it turned out that every Travis machine was trying to load Rubygems from the opposite side of the country. And that was why there were network errors, because Rubygems would send users to CloudFront, and then CloudFront would check where your DNS server was to tell you which server to use, using like DNS geolocation to try and give you the fastest server possible. And then because the DNS servers were so wildly wrong and hard-coded, CloudFront would send the Travis machines to like the wrong side of the country to try and download gems. Finally, I mean, once we figured that out, it was actually not that hard to get Blue Box to fix it, and then suddenly failures stopped happening all the time, and everything was really great for like 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, you had to retry everything all the time again. And lots of people were just like, oh, it's the same thing, it's still broken. That really upset me because of the amount of effort that I put into fixing the DNS problem, and I was like, no, this is a completely different problem. So I eventually managed to figure out that with the help of Evan Phoenix, who helps, he is on Ruby Central, which is like the nonprofit in the United States that runs the RubyConf and RailsConf conferences, and also pays for rubygems.org. So he helped me debug the SSL issue that meant that connections to Rubygems failed all the time. Basically, it turned out that the issue was if your connection was slow, the Rubygems server would just cut you off in the middle of setting up an SSL connection, and it would just decide that you weren't really going to actually do it. And the timeout was set very low to like a single second, even though multiple round trips were needed. So if you were far enough away, or you just happened to have a moment of connection lag, the request would fail. So we increased the SSL connection establishment timeout, and suddenly that worked way better. So ultimately, Rubygems.org has had a pretty rough year, actually. But as far as I know, everything is now fixed, and you guys, like, not just people who live here, but like people all over the entire world should now be able to talk to Rubygems.org successfully without having to retry over and over and over. So that's a big improvement. So with that out of the way, I started to concentrate on the next thing that I'm working on doing for Rubygems and for Bundler, which is making gem install and bundle install way faster. That's like the super interesting part. So to explain how I'm making it faster, I kind of have to explain how it works now, and then explain how it's going to work so that it makes sense why it's so much faster. So I'm going to start with how it works today. Basically, when you want to install a gem today, using either Rubygems like gem install or using Bundler where you run bundle install, your computer has to go make a request to rubygems.org, which right now runs just on AWS, just in the US East zone, and the East Coast of the United States is actually pretty far away from here, so that's part of the reason. You have to go from here all the way to the East Coast of the US and say, hey, I would like to install this gem. Can you tell me about all of the versions of this gem? When you run, say, bundle install, Bundler needs to know about all of the gems that it might install, and so it has to ask for a list, effectively, of all of the gems that currently exist. That's a pretty big list. It keeps getting bigger. It needs a lot of memory. It takes a lot of time to transfer. Because that list is so big, we built the Bundler API, which is like a separate thing, which is, yes, that is the thing that took rubygems.org down before, but now that it's hosted separately on Heroku and everything stays up, basically what happens is if your gem file just has rack in it, then instead of asking for the list of every gem ever, just in case it needs to know about them, Bundler says, hey, just tell me about rack. Give me all the versions of rack. And so that API has to do more work on the server side because it's only returning the specific things that were requested, but it means that a lot less data has to be transferred, and so bundle install gets faster. That is with a really fast connection, though. If you have a slow connection, it's possible, like, basically if you have a slow connection, it's bad both ways. The way where you have to either download a giant file, which means you have to do a bunch of data transfer, or the problem with the API way is that if you want to install Rails, so like you have just a super simple gem file, it just says gem Rails, and you run bundle install. Using the API, Bundler will say, hey, tell me about all the versions of Rails so that I know which one I can install. And then Rubygems will say, well, there's all these versions of Rails, but Rails depends on active support, active record, action pack, I18N, all of these other gems. And then Bundler will be like, oh, I don't actually know which version of Rails I can install until I know which versions of action pack and active support and I18N and all of these gems I can also install. So, okay, tell me all about all of those gems. And then the rubygems.org server says, okay, well, action pack. Well, action pack actually depends on active mailer. And then Bundler has to be like, okay, well, tell me about active mailer. And so all this back and forth has to happen. And if you have a really high latency connection to the rubygems.org servers, this takes a really long time. And if you're far away from the East Coast of the United States, you have probably both a slow and a high latency connection. So your options are one slow option or another slow option rather than a slow option and a fast option. So this is kind of a bummer. So here's how, after that happens, here's how the thing that I'm going to change to make things significantly faster is basically like the index that lists all of the gems and then lists all of the versions of all of the gems that exist. I guess at one point someone started calling it the gem index and it stuck. I don't think there's any place in the code that calls it that. I'm not sure like where that came from exactly, but that seems to be what everyone called it, so I keep calling it that too. So the Rubygems server provides a set of files, not just a list of all of the gems, but also specific files about specific gems. So the server says, Rails 4.0.1, there is a single file that contains just the gem spec for that gem. And the gem spec contains information like what gems that gem depends on, what version of Ruby that gem depends on, who the author is, all the like normal gem spec information. And so in the very, very first version of Rubygems, Rubygems would just download these files. It would say, hey, give me the Rails gem spec, give me the Sinatra gem spec. And that turned impractical pretty fast. And so once there were like tens or hundreds of gems, they started compressing them together into a single file and then marshalling it. So there's a file, marshal, and it's just all of the gem specs, just put into an array in Ruby, and then you call marshal.dump, and that's the file. So it's every gem spec all at once. If you're bundler, this is super great because what you need is all of the dependencies of all of the versions. So like if you want to bundle Rails, bundler needs to know about all of the versions of Rails and then needs to know about all of the dependencies of all of the versions of Rails. And so this Marshall file was the only option when bundler was first created. It would just download every gem spec and then it would be able to figure out which ones it could install. So the problem is this is super slow. At this point there are, last time I looked, something like 75,000 gems and something like 750,000 versions of those 75,000 gems. And since there's a separate gem spec for every version, that means that this Marshall file now contains like 750,000 gem specification objects in a giant array. And looking for things in an array is pretty slow. You have to keep looking through the array over and over. This is a giant pain in the butt to process all 750,000 entries when all you actually wanted was, say, rack. It got slightly better with the specs file, which very confusingly does not contain specs. Instead of containing gem specs, which is what's in the Marshall file, the specs file just contains an array with the name of the gem, the version of the gem, and the platform of the gem, like JRuby or MSWin or nothing if it's just plain Ruby and can run on any platform. So if you use the specs GZ file, then you can only download just the single gem spec for the gems that you care about because you know the name of the gem and the version of the gem. And that name and version allows you to build the URL to the gem spec. So if you download just specs.gz, you can say, oh, I can download just the Sinatra 142 gem spec. This takes more round trips, but means that you don't have to transfer this entire gigantic file with 750,000 entries. It also means that you never have to load that array into memory, which helps a lot if you don't have hundreds and hundreds of megabytes of memory floating around. So eventually, like I was describing before, the bundler API tells you only about the gems that you actually want to install. And so you can say, just tell me about Rails, just tell me about Active Record and Action Pack. And then once you have that information, you can download just the gem specs that you actually want. And then you're done and everything's kind of okay. This could definitely be better. This is not the best. So earlier this year, after we got the bundler API set up and working again on Heroku, and so things were back to at least as fast as they'd ever been, I spent a lot of time kind of like talking to everyone else who works on Rubygems and everyone who works on bundler and everyone who works on rubygems.org, and we kind of said, like what we have right now is basically just, well, we could make it a little bit better if we made this change. Well, we could make it a little bit better if we made this change. And I said, like if you were going to start from scratch and just make something that does exactly what we need now, what would it look like? And so I kind of like talked with all of these people and sort of worked to consolidate everything that everyone thought would be good into a single plan. And that plan is basically just about trying to make installing gems as fast as we can using the ideas of everyone who has worked on it. So we have a plan now. It's going to be super great. It's not totally done yet, but I'll talk about that later. So the plan is actually pretty straightforward, but it's very different from everything that we've done before. We're just going to use plain text indexes. The lists of gems and the dependencies that those gems have are just going to be in text. You'll be able to parse them with string.split. There will be no YAML, there will be no executable vulnerabilities, there will be no Ruby objects. There's just going to be strings, and we're just going to pull them out of the text files, and then we'll know what the gem name is, what the gem version is, and what the gem dependencies are. So one of the cool upsides to having a plain text format that's not YAML, or having a plain text format that's not Marshall, I'm sorry, is that you can add to a plain text file, and you can't just add to the end of a Marshall file. Being able to just add to the end of a file means that if the client downloads the file, it never needs to download the entire file from scratch again. So like these files that take so much time to transfer, you'll be able to just download it once, and then Rubygems and Bundler will have a copy on your computer. And if you need to install a gem later, you can just say to the Rubygem server, hey, tell me about the new gems since this last one that I know about. And the server can say, well, here's just what you need to add to that file to know about all the gems that exist. And if the file hasn't changed at all, the server can just say back, nope, you're all good. And that, like just that, will be a huge improvement, because right now, every single time you ever run gem install or bundle install, you have to re-download the list of every gem, like of every version of every gem that you might install. And then if you run bundle install 3 seconds after you finish the last bundle install, it has to go and download every version of every gem, information about them all again. You can't like keep any of it. So that should make things a whole lot better. After that's done, I have a plan to make things even more better. And that's to actually have all of these files hosted by a CDN instead of hosted only on the rubygems.org server on the East Coast. So right now, if you want to install a gem, the gem file is on CloudFront, which is a CDN that's all around the world. But if you want to get information about those gems so that you know where to get that file, you still have to talk to the East Coast. Once you can get that from like a local CDN, that means that there will be a CDN somewhere in Asia that you can talk to and not have to go all the way to the US just to find out what gems exist so that you can get them installed. I'm really excited about that. After that, I'd even like to build a thing that lets you have local mirrors, so you can just run a server and it will go get a file from the CDN, but once it's cached, you can just get it right away, so you can run this like in your data center, and then when you do a deploy, bundle install will be practically instantaneous because the files are all already there inside your data center. So I'm going to tell you about the new index really fast because I'm almost out of time, but basically the plain text files are just, there's two types of files. There's one file that's versions, and then one file that's the name of the gem. So inside the versions file, there's just a list of gems. The gem named Rack has versions 1, 1.01, 1.02, Sinatra, etc. So when there's a new version of a gem, we just add that new version to the bottom of the file, and then everyone else can just download that one line, and they don't have to re-download the entire file from scratch. Once you know the name and version, and this actually includes the platform along with the version in this file, so once you know the name, you can go to get the file that tells you about that gem. and the file that tells you about that gem will just say, hey, here's, so like Sinatra 1.0 depends on rack 1.0 or greater. We'll also be able to put things in that file like the version of Ruby that the gem depends on and the version of Rubygems that the gem depends on, which right now we don't know. So I don't know if you've ever run into this, but it's a super annoying problem where you might try to run bundle install and it will try to install a version of a gem that doesn't work on your version of Ruby. If you still run bundle install on Ruby 1.8, there are some gems that now will only run on Ruby 1.9 or even 2.0 or greater, and Bundler doesn't even know that until after it's downloaded the entire gem to install it. And this will fix that. So that's really exciting. I was able to work on most of this thanks to a grant from Ruby Central. I spent about a day or a day and a half each week working on that for the second half of last year. And I was able to do all of this design work, build the new, so there's a prototype that actually works. There's a branch of Bundler and a branch of the Bundler API, and they use this new index format that I just described to talk to each other and to install gems. It's pretty exciting. The next, kind of like what needs to happen next is to get the prototype into shipping version of Bundler, and then we want to get that same code into Rubygems itself, so that everyone is sharing this faster code and using the new faster index. Then we're going to switch to Fastly, and everything should be super great. I would also like to heavily advocate for you upgrading to the newest version of Bundler that exists right now, because you can speed things up by installing gems in parallel. This is built into Bundler 1.5. If you have multiple cores in your machine, this will let you at least download and install 4 gems at the same time instead of just 1. Let's see. 1.5 also includes a feature where you can set up mirrors. I tried this. I don't think it's actually faster, but you may want to try it and see if it's faster for you. There's a Rubygems mirror in Tokyo. You might be able to get faster bundle installs by setting your bundler up to use that instead of using the East Coast copy. Bundler 1.6 also includes a new resolver, which is super awesome and fixes all of the bugs with figuring out which versions of which gems to use. Ultimately, the next version of Bundler will include super fast installs and the new index format. If you're interested in helping with this, that would be super awesome. Everyone who works on Bundler does not get paid to do it and just works on it in their free time. If you have time to work on Bundler and inclination, we have a contributing document that tells you all about how to contribute and what we would like help with. If you don't have time to help, but you work at a company that uses Bundler heavily, you can also contribute with dollars that will go straight towards Bundler core team members having more time to spend to make Bundler better using GitTip. That's everything I had.